We're taking a look here at Pathfinder, the core second, I guess it's not second edition, but the new version of Pathfinder adventure card game. I've got the core set out here, and I also have the first adventure path, which I'm not showing right now. And for this video, I want to talk a little bit about some points regarding the redesign or the further development of this system. I've played a number of versions of the first system, Rise of the Rune Lords, Mummy's Mask, and Skulls and Shackles, and it is a card game that I put into my top five. I think it was number five on the sort of light solo card games that I play a lot a couple of years ago. I do enjoy the system for what it is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in this video. And I have begun to play the second or this new iteration of it and have read a bunch of stuff online about the development and the changes and positive and negative, and I thought I would come in with some of my thoughts and opinions about it, starting first with this question of story. The storybook in the Pathfinder redeveloped version, or 2E, or I don't really know what to call it, but the new version, the 2019 version, is a separate storybook, and this is one of the most notable physical differences between the two versions. Actually, there aren't terribly many physical differences, but this is certainly one of them. So that the adventure paths are a little bit more developed, and there is this explicit story and campaign that you have and are meant to go through this and then moving on. The question is whether this is successful, and that is the question, I should say, that people ask online. And I would argue with sort of the basis of that question, which is really, is this a game that is meant to be developing a story? It's trying to be developing a story. It's Pathfinder, first of all, the adventure card game. So I understand the idea of trying to develop a story, but I would argue that this notion that you're going to get a big narrative out of here, even with this storybook, does set up false expectations and expectations that are bound to be not fulfilled, because for for me in playing it, the mechanics of this game really do override any notion of story. And the best that you can do is what I try to do. I've got this set up just to demonstrate what was happening here. I was playing this game earlier, and one of my kids was watching me, and she's a little young, so I try to involve her in the game. She rolls the dice, and I tell a little bit of a story. So in this particular instance, I was telling her that our gnome druid Linny here was out in the forest and came upon this caravan, which is the location that we're in. And I will say I'm certainly not the first to say this, that many of the location cards are quite dark, which is unfortunate. I think at least many of the ones that I've seen here, I'll show you the campsite that we have set up, dark, and also this trail location, dark. In any case, the caravan with these horses, Linny came upon them in the forest, and who did she encounter? But she encountered this goblin troublemaker. And it's a cute little character, or at least it can be played that way if you're trying not to scare your kid, because you'll have payback for that when the nightmares happen that night. And made up a little story about the two of them, and then based on that story, we made our selections and rolled our dice to get through the encounter and ultimately get rid of the goblin. To me, that's enough of the story here. I don't really see this game as being successful in translating a larger narrative, larger campaign onto it, because the mechanics of play in this game are very I think, override the narrative too much. That in essence, what you're doing, as you know, certainly if you've played this game or read anything about it, is you really are in essence just turning over cards and trying to take your cards and defeat those cards that way. And you can, of course, think and really pay attention to the attributes that might be necessary to acquire this. So dexterity, ranged, and stealth, of course, all that makes sense with a short bow weapon, for example. But the reality is, if you're trying to acquire this card, most likely you're simply looking through your hand of cards, matching some keywords, and seeing whether or not you want to spend those cards to boost your die roll, and how important it is to get this based on the attributes it has. I mean, it's challenging, I think, to get beyond that. Now, I have played Apocrypha and done a video on Apocrypha, which I absolutely love. Very similar mechanic, more complicated, same designer, more complicated, but that, because there are more complications in and additional mechanics to that game and additional ways of using the dice, I think the narrative and the story is easier to come through than, for me at least, here. Now, in my case, that's not a negative for this game. I really like this game. I like the new changes that have been made to this version of it, and I'll get into some of them in a moment. But one of the changes, this kind of boosting of the narrative, which is what I think is being talked about a lot and trying to be a sell, for me, it just doesn't really make a difference, because for me, that is not it doesn't succeed in really changing my investment in this or my experience of it as a story, nor is the fact that I don't experience it as a story a negative, because for me it's not. I'm not looking to this game for that kind of overarching story. If anything, I'm creating a story because of the way that I am perhaps engaging one of my kids when I'm playing it. And then if the kid wanders away, I'm just kind of continuing along and enjoying playing playing a game where I get to look at the different cards. All the cards are unique, and except for the blessings, all the cards are unique, and that's really great because you can look at the various cards you have and just appreciate how that individual card, what it's meant to do, and kind of think about your character as a totality. And certainly the cards that Linny has, her animal allies and her druidic nature, come through with the cards that she gets and the way she gets to build her deck. But that, to me, again, does not translate to a story. But also, I'm not looking for a story here, so it's not a negative, it's just a fact of this game. There are quite a few differences in the card design with this new core set from the old Pathfinder, and I think they make a big difference. Here's me holding a hand of 5 cards of the original game with this is 3 weapons and 2 spells, and this is how I would hold a hand of cards if I held it up, and you can see what's available to see. And here is me holding a hand of the same card distribution, 3 weapons, 2 spells of the new design. And you can see quite clearly when you compare the two that with the newer design, it's much easier at a glance to see what you have. Now, granted, you can't see necessarily the entire word of your weapon right there, for example, but you can certainly see some of it. And also, this indication of the color coding on the side is helpful in determining what type of card it is. And I think when I saw the cards online initially, I wondered, well, why limit the design to this one corner? And once I actually started playing it, I saw how it made so much sense. And I'll show you a different hand mixture of cards, and you'll see how it comes up. But at a glance, this side design is used to help you see what you've got, and also just for visual appeal. Whereas here, when you're holding these cards, you can't see any of these things. You can see some keywords, but that's it. You can't tell what you have at all because of the layout there. And this isn't helpful to key it necessarily either. So that's one comparison, and let me show you just one more comparison like this. Now, the other way that I look through cards, if I'm looking through cards, is to do this, to sort through them this way. Now, I'm left-handed, so maybe this is just one of those rare times where what I'm saying is more relevant to lefties and righties, but in any case, I sort of scroll through them this way if I'm searching for something, and you can see doing it like this for these different cards, you can see how clearly these show up. By comparison, doing the same type of scrolling through here, this is how they show up. And to me, this is much easier to see in the revised version. The color differentiation is greater, obviously the font is bigger, etc. And again, to look at these two five cards as a hand, you could see holding it like this. You get some indication of what you have. Clearly the blessing is standing out, and this is the weapon that we saw before, the ally. The ally is not so much differentiated from the item. I guess that's differentiated only here. Could be slightly better for that regard, but I think all of it overall, looking at the same configuration of a hand here, where it's much more monochromatic and much less clear of what is behind your lead card here. And then just a side-by-side comparison of two hands that you might be experiencing in the game. And looking through the individual cards, it stands out a lot with the blessings that we're just going to scroll through just to give you a visual on them. I think that the new design is more vibrant, and even though this background, again, when I saw this background in videos or pictures, I thought it was strange, but it does make sense when you're actually holding the cards in the hand, because it separates out pieces of information on the card quite clearly. So this is just sort of random blessings from the new core set, and here's some random blessings from the old core set, or the old set. And again, perhaps, or I guess definitely a matter of taste, but to my taste, the new blessing deck is not only more vibrant, but the way in which the text is laid out is it's just a lot more pleasing, having been broken up that way, and more succinct. And finally, we'll look through some item cards just quickly in this vein to get an impression of the design and what you see when you scroll through them in the core set. There's a couple of these tomes I really like, as compared to some random item cards from the original game. Again, a matter of taste, but to my taste, the art in overall, the art in these games, I think, is wildly variant. So there are some locations that are quite finely detailed, albeit rather dark in the new version, and then there are things like this, which are, not so inspiring. And I think the same holds true. The same holds true here. But overall, to me, the new core set cards are just much more engaging and pleasant to look at. By far, the biggest difference in the cards you can see here as they're stored in the box. These are the cards from the new version that are stored vertically with the dividers, and these are the cards from various other Pathfinder versions. And I'll have to say, this is not the Pathfinder box that I have them stored in. I long ago gave away that box. It was massive and useless. It did not have these dividers. This is actually the Apocrypha box, and the rest of this box is Apocrypha. But you can see that I'm storing the Pathfinder cards here horizontally, and these little red sort of lines are other cards that I've made as dividers, but it's not very useful because I can't tell what is what. It's all even. There were no dividers in the other one, and no way to store it. And here, this is the original core box with the cardboard dividers here, which will allow the sleeved cards to fit in without being damaged, whereas the original Pathfinder box did not. My cards started to get damaged, and I moved them out and ultimately threw away that massive box because even with all the adventure paths I had, it was just too big, and with no interior division, it just didn't work. So this is a vast improvement over this, I should say, is a vast improvement over that in terms of organizing your cards and storing your cards. Much has been said online about the tokens and off-printing of the tokens. You can see that, I guess, a little bit here on the back. It's not particularly even, and the cheapness of them, and you can see here in terms of the little nibs that need to be trimmed off. You know, I'll agree, the tokens are definitely not great. They could have been better. I do like the fact that there's these various colors. I mean, you don't often see this in a game, like a kind of artistic splat rendering, but it's unfortunate that, you know, you have a token that comes out looking like this. I punched it out really super carefully, and it still, you know, needs to be dealt with in that way. Perfectly functional. You could also use your own tokens for the game because the backside of them is simply just a 1 hero point indicator. So there would be many ways to use different things. I may use some gems or something that I have just to bling it up a little bit. Although I do actually like the the art design, the art direction on the tokens. I like. It's just the quality of the cardboard could definitely be better. And the other big new component that may be of interest to people are the standees. I never use standees. I really don't like them, but they are here, and this may be a plus a selling point to somebody. For me, it's just a neutral. I mean, I punched them out and they're here, but I'll use various other things that I have. This might be Linny, whatever. So, but the standees should be mentioned because that is definitely a change from the other edition. The other thing that's changed has been the rule book, and the most obvious change is the orientation of it. This is a standard vertically oriented book, and this example from Skull and Shackles is the horizontal version. I find it easier just to read the vertical version. But what's most important and significant, I think, in terms of the rules is the addition of a much welcomed glossary here in the new core set, with not only the terms, but it's really a combination of a glossary and an index, which is excellent. You have the definition of the term and then the page that explains the rule with it. So during recovery, you can find on page 6, and then throughout the rule book, you will find there are bolded words or terms, and those tell you that that is going to be found in that glossary. So the cross-referencing here is excellent, and I think it is needed. This is not a particularly complicated game at all, mechanically, at least for me, but there are, it's almost over-explained, to be honest with you, in the rules. I think it's easier, if you play this game, I think you know what I mean. It's easier to explain this game to a new player than hand them the rule set. And of course, that's the case with many things, but I think particularly here, a lot of it is overwritten, but it's very helpful as I flip through the older rule book to show, you know, all this block of text. You've got summoning and adding cards, for example, is here. And let's just quickly look it up. First of all, we can easily look it up here by going to the back here, summon page 14, and we'll see that the summon cards and new cards, you have these things bolded, reset, trigger. It's easier to find, it's easier to pull out and identify, and when you come to a term on a card, you can immediately go here, find the term, and then reference what you need. So I think that aspect of this rule set is a big improvement over this one. But really, ultimately, the question is the gameplay are the gameplay changes in this second edition positive or negative? And for my experience thus far, they have been positive. Let me show you a couple of them. So we're back to this goblin troublemaker, this guy, and you'll notice that he's got an indication here that says his powers, and it says before acting, that's before you act. Succeed at a dexterity, constitution, acrobatics, or fortitude 4 check, or roll a 1d4. And he's, again, thematic. You've got to put a little effort into it, but you have to be able to try to get out of the way of this guy. He's a troublemaker. He's going to attack you first with something if you can't get out of the way. Now, Linny here has basically, she doesn't have acrobatics or fortitude, but she does have, obviously, her dexterity and her constitution should be rolling a d8. So a 50% chance if she simply takes that check. And within here, what I really want to point out is of these difficulties is this Scourge Poisoned. Scourges are a new mechanic in this game, and here is a look at the Scourge cards. They are, that reminds me kind of in Arkham Horror, where you have some negative phobia put onto you or whatever. I don't know if any of these are phobias actually, but it's a scourge. That's what it is. So we will look and see, and this indication here is the token. So if you have the scourge, this is a scourge reference card because other people in the party could have the scourge, then you would take the corresponding token and place it with your character to remind yourself that that is the scourge that you have. And the particular scourge that we could potentially have a 25% chance of getting is poisoned. And for while you are marked with poisoned, after you reset, you have to recharge a random card. That's pretty significant and will force you to make some tough choices along the way in terms of getting rid of cards, not permanently, but getting them out of your hand. And you can get rid of this when you have an opportunity to heal. You can remove the scourge instead. So that could stick around for a while. That's something I really would definitely not want to get on me, especially this early in the game. Now, there's only a 25% chance of it, but nevertheless, it forces a little bit more decision making when I look at my hand of cards to see, is there something I can do to help myself initially in encountering this goblin troublemaker. And I see that I do have a spell that this spell here, the aid spell. I could aid myself on any check, freely banish to add 1d4 plus the number, which here in this case is 1. I probably will do that, and I don't know if this freely is a term that's new to this edition. When I encountered it, I thought it was, but it has been a while since I played the other edition. In this case, what it means is that I can use this spell freely and still have the opportunity to use another spell to do something else in my same turn. So it takes away that restriction of just using one card of the same type. In any case, my assessment here is with a 50% chance of getting a whole bunch of damage early on, I'm going to use this spell to add the 1d4 to my roll. So this is going to be then giving me a d4 and a d8 plus 1 roll to avoid the possible initial damage that this troublemaker wants to inflict on me. So let's just see if we can do that here. And wow, he did not. Look at that. 1 and 1. The worst we could have rolled, we did roll. So, such is this game. So we have made our best effort, but this guy is actually going to cause us some trouble. So we wasted a spell. We did not avoid having to roll this 1d4 with a pretty significant chance of having something bad happen. So might as well carry this through to the end, and really just don't want to get poisoned. So these are the options here, and of course, guess what?
Well, this is a good demonstration of how the scourge will work. So I am going to suffer the scourge poisoned. So as mentioned, what will happen is I will bring out the scourge card. Now I'm playing solo. I've got two characters here. I'm playing solo, but were you playing with a group, as mentioned, you could, more than one party member could become poisoned throughout the game. So this is why you have the indication of the token, and I will take this and place it with my character to remind myself that I need to check and see what's going on here with my poisoning as it continues through the game. The other point I want to mention on the Scourge cards that took me a while, I'm definitely not the most observant person, it took me a while to realize that on the back of the Scourge card is what I really, really, really wished had been in the other edition, which is this reference here, particularly these terms, which I'm always confusing, and I so didn't notice it that I made my own little reminder card. I couldn't find this from my other version, but I don't need this because it's right here. So on the back of the Scourge cards are these references, and you can pull one out and use it. It would have been nice if it was just a separate card, I think, but in any case, it's certainly not the case that you'll be using up all of these Scourges at once, so you'll have some reference card available to you. Anyway, that is a little discussion of the Scourge mechanic and how it works. It does two things, really. It adds some theme, and it also adds some decision making because it will just give another level of choice in terms of what card you're using. And this game really does boil down to those types of decisions. Are you risking, using something now for a benefit to avoid a potential negative? Is it worth it? Whatever. As you can see, my decision was not worth it because of the die roll. Yes, this is a game that is ultimately full of luck, and no matter what I did there, I rolled ones on both of my dice, so that was not going to help me. But that's a fair demonstration of the what this type of mechanic adds. And now, as I move forward, I have to remember that I'm poisoned, so it will have the lingering effect of forcing me to continue to recharge a random card. That's key. So I'm going to need to, after I reset, after I get my new hand, randomly recharge a card, and that's going to stink. And then, of course, adding insult to injury, I pull in the very next turn with all my new cards, my frog ally, and of course his benefit. This exploration, the first time you would suffer a scourge, ignore it instead. But I did not have my faithful frog with me at the time, so I'm continuing on poisoned, and that's just a further irritation. But all of this kind of stuff adds, I think, to the involvement of the game because you become attached to the particular characters that you have that could help you, and frustrated with what happens. Something else that's new is this key word and mechanic, display. What this means is that you can, well, we'll see. While displayed, when you suffer cold or combat damage, you may recharge to reduce it by 1. When you suffer any damage, you may bury it to reduce it to 0. So what this means is, on this armor card here, this leather armor card, you may display it, which is basically like wearing the card, wearing the piece of clothing, to have these benefits until you use the benefit up. And when it's displayed, it does not count as being in your hand. It doesn't go against your hand size. It's just out on the table. And this makes a ton of sense because it just, again, thematically, you would be wearing armor that you acquired, and it gives you the benefit over more than just one turn. Another new mechanic that I think is one of the stronger ones is the avenge mechanic. And what this means is that when poor Linny here, after she failed miserably to deal with this goblin troublemaker, if Sajan was at the same location, and he could avenge avenge her loss. And what this means is he could attempt to do the encounter to get rid of this goblin troublemaker, but there's a penalty for doing that, and the penalty he'd have to pay is to bury one of his cards to come in and then avenge this. And once again, it's a mechanic that makes thematic sense, that you're helping your compatriot at the location, which is something I think really was missing in the other game. And also, it is one that makes a choice for you, because he has to decide based on the cards he has on his hand, is he willing to basically sacrifice one of them to try to avenge this goblin, or maybe just have the goblin go back in there and encounter him on its own. So the avenge mechanic is another great one. And another great one is the fact that the blessings deck now have some initial uh, powers that it's called the hours deck. So as you use the blessings for the keeping of time, which is still the case, the current blessing is the hour. And some of the blessings, not all of them, but some of them have specific effects. So if this is the hour of the blessing, there's no effect. If this is the hour of the blessing, it means that whenever you would discard a boon to bless a dexterity or charisma check, you may recharge it instead. So it's giving you an actual blessing for that turn during the course of the hour. And this, again, adds a little level of something that's going on. Now, many of them don't have an effect, but some of them do. Here's another effect. After your exploration, you may move to a random location. So it is a nice blessing from above that is a new mechanic in the game that I think also adds a lot to the gameplay. There are a whole bunch of other things in the game that are new that I'm not going to detail, but some of them involve being proficient in certain traits in addition to card types, or you could be vulnerable to a trait, which is going to give you a +4 to a bonus check if a card is vulnerable to the trait you have, or you can be resistant to it. So those are little tweaks. A bigger tweak, and the last thing I'm going to mention here, is the difficulty tweak. So you'll notice here on this location, they have small, medium, and large deck size, and this corresponds to the difficulty level of the deck. So for quote-unquote average difficulty, you would follow the medium setup. For a more challenging or larger deck, you would follow this, and obviously the shorter or smaller version, you would follow this. They also suggest other types of tweaks in terms of how many blessings you put out to lengthen or shorten the game, and thereby increase or decrease or increase the difficulty. These kinds of things maybe people house ruled before, but are now baked into the system, and I think add a lot to it. Overall, I felt that the character played a bit stronger for me because of some of the benefits that they have in terms of, in this case, recharging and burying cards. It seemed like there were more ways of keeping cards in your hand, or keeping cards in your draw pile, I should say, and recycling them than I remember from the other game. But I can't sort of strongly come out and say that this is actually a difference. It was an impression that I had. I haven't played through enough of the characters and enough of the scenarios to know that for sure. But it did feel like initially even the characters were more buffed up in this version than in the last. So in terms of my overall thoughts about this, to me, the new core set is a big improvement over the other one. The card design, the visuals make it easier to play, easier to store, easier to see what you're doing at a glance. The mechanics, some of which I've described here and some of which I haven't, that have been added in, I think don't feel like just extra rules. They feel as if they are even making it a smoother gameplay, more intuitive, more natural if you're trying to get into the story. What has not changed for me from the first edition, despite the addition of the storybook, is the story. I mean, to me, I'm not getting more of a story out of it than I did before. As I mentioned at the outset of the video, that's okay for me because I'm not really looking for this to story. Maybe ironically, maybe not, but that's not why I play this game. I think if you are somebody that felt the story was lacking and wanted more, you will probably you will probably be very happy with the way this is developed more. It's easier to read, there's more of it, and certainly is definitely a development of a story and a campaign. So overall, I'm really pleased with the new core set of Pathfinder. I will be integrating in some way my certainly my Skull and Shackles cards, because I don't I love the pirate theme, and I will be integrating that in some way into it. And the rule book here does tell you how you can do that. So you're given this transition guide and indication of how it's compatible with the other sets. So if you have other Pathfinder material, you'll find a way to use it here.